In a small village nestled between rolling hills and quiet forests, there lived a young person whose days were marked by an unrelenting restlessness. The village itself was a place of simple beauty, where the rhythm of life moved with the seasons, where neighbors knew each other's names, and where the temple bell rang softly at dawn and dusk. Yet, despite this tranquility, the young person felt as though they were living behind a veil, separated from the peace that seemed to touch everyone else. Each morning brought the same heavy feeling, a weight in the chest that no amount of work or distraction could lift. They would walk through the market, observing others who laughed easily, who seemed content with their modest lives, and wonder what secret ingredient they possessed that remained hidden from view. The young person had tried many things to fill the emptiness within. They had pursued achievements, sought recognition, accumulated possessions, and formed relationships. Yet nothing brought lasting satisfaction. Each accomplishment felt hollow within days. Each new possession lost its luster. Each relationship revealed the same patterns of disappointment. At night, lying awake under the vast darkness, they would stare at the ceiling and ask questions that had no easy answers. Why did life feel so difficult? Why did happiness always seem just beyond reach? Why did the mind create so much suffering from situations that others navigated with ease? These questions became companions, following them through their days like shadows, whispering doubts and fears that grew louder in moments of stillness. The young person had heard stories of a monk who lived on the mountain beyond the village, a man of great age and wisdom who had spent decades in meditation and study. Travelers spoke of his peaceful presence, of the way his words could cut through confusion like sunlight through morning mist. Some said he possessed special powers. Others claimed he was simply a kind old man who listened well. The young person had dismissed these stories as exaggerations, as the romanticized tales that people tell about those who choose lives of solitude. But as the months passed and the inner turmoil grew more intense, as the nights became longer and the questions more pressing, the young person found their thoughts returning again and again to this mysterious monk. Perhaps, they thought, this teacher could offer some technique, some practice, some secret teaching that would finally bring the peace they sought. And so, one autumn morning when the leaves were beginning to turn gold and red, the young person decided to make the journey up the mountain. They packed a small bag with provisions, told their family they would return in a few days, and set out on the winding path that led into the forested slopes. The journey was longer and more difficult than anticipated. The path grew steep and narrow, requiring careful attention with each step. The forest around them was dense with ancient trees, whose branches formed a canopy that filtered the sunlight into shifting patterns of light and shadow. Birds called from hidden perches, and occasionally a deer would appear on the trail ahead before bounding silently into the underbrush. As they climbed higher, the air grew cooler and thinner, and the sounds of the village below faded into silence. The young person's mind, usually filled with constant chatter, began to quiet somewhat in response to the demands of the physical journey. Each step required focus, each breath became more conscious, and the ordinary concerns that usually dominated their thoughts seemed less urgent in this wild place. By late afternoon, they reached a small clearing where a simple hermitage stood, a modest wooden structure with a tiled roof, surrounded by carefully tended gardens. Smoke rose gently from a chimney, and the sound of a small stream could be heard nearby. The young person approached slowly, uncertain of the protocol for meeting such a teacher. Before they could call out, an elderly monk emerged from the hermitage, moving with a grace that seemed to contradict his apparent age. His face was deeply lined, yet his eyes were bright and clear, holding a quality of attention that made the young person feel both seen and accepted. The monk smiled gently and gestured for them to approach. Without speaking, he indicated that the young person should sit on a wooden bench near the garden, and then he disappeared briefly into the hermitage, returning with tea and simple cakes. They sat together in silence for a time, sipping tea, Watching the afternoon light move across the garden, the young person felt their prepared speech, their carefully crafted explanation of their suffering, dissolving in this unexpected peace. Finally, the monk spoke, his voice soft but clear. The monk's first words were not what the young person expected. He did not ask about their problems or invite them to explain their suffering. Instead, he said simply, "You have traveled far today. The mountain path is steep, and you must be tired. Rest here, and we will talk when you are ready." This gentle acknowledgement of their physical state, this absence of immediate inquiry into their psychological distress, created a space of ease that the young person had not felt in a long time. They realized how much tension they had been carrying, how the very act of seeking help had become another burden, another thing they had to do correctly. As the evening descended and the light softened into dusk, the monk prepared a simple meal of rice, vegetables, and soup. They ate together in companionable silence, and afterward, the monk showed the young person to a small guest room where they could sleep. The room was sparse but clean, containing only a sleeping mat, a blanket, and a small window that looked out over the valley below. That night, despite their exhaustion, the young person found sleep elusive. The silence of the mountain was profound, broken only by the occasional call of a night bird or the whisper of wind through the trees. In this silence, their thoughts seemed louder than ever, rushing through their mind in endless streams of worry and analysis. They thought about their life in the village, about all the ways they had failed to find peace, about the desperate hope that had brought them to this mountain. Morning came slowly, announced by the gradual brightening of the sky and the sound of the monk moving about the hermitage. The young person rose and found the monk in the garden, tending to plants with careful attention. The monk looked up, smiled, and invited them to join in the morning routine. Together, they worked in silence, weeding, watering, and harvesting vegetables for the day's meals. There was something deeply satisfying about this simple work, about the feeling of hands in soil, about the immediate and tangible results of each action. After the morning tasks were completed, and they had eaten a simple breakfast, the monk finally asked the young person to tell their story. Sitting together in the main room of the hermitage, with morning light streaming through the windows, the young person began to speak. They talked about their feelings of inadequacy, their constant anxiety, their sense of being fundamentally flawed or broken. They described the endless cycle of seeking and disappointment, the way nothing seemed to provide lasting satisfaction. They spoke of their fear of failure, their worry about the future, their regret about the past. The words poured out in a torrent, and the monk listened with complete attention, his face reflecting a deep compassion but no pity, understanding but no judgment. When the young person finally fell silent, exhausted by the outpouring of their suffering, the monk sat quietly for a moment, as if allowing the words to settle. Then he spoke, and his words carried a quality of certainty that came from direct experience rather than mere belief. "What you describe," the monk said, "is the common condition of human beings who have not yet awakened to their true nature. You are suffering not because there is something wrong with you, but because you have forgotten something essential, something that has always been present but has been obscured by layers of conditioning and false beliefs. Let me tell you a story that may illuminate what I mean." The monk settled into his seat and began to speak in a measured, gentle tone. There was once a traveler who found themselves in a foreign land, far from home and without resources. They were hungry, tired, and afraid, sleeping in doorways and begging for food. This traveler carried with them a small leather pouch that had been given to them by a dying relative, but they had never opened it, assuming it contained nothing of value. For years, they lived in poverty and desperation, always one step away from complete destitution. One day, another traveler noticed the pouch and asked to examine it. Reluctantly, the poor traveler agreed. The second traveler opened the pouch and gasped in amazement, for inside was a diamond of extraordinary size and purity, worth more than a king's ransom. The poor traveller stared in disbelief at this treasure they had carried for years without knowing its value. In an instant, everything changed. They were not poor at all. They never had been. They had been carrying wealth beyond imagination the entire time, suffering needlessly because they did not recognize what they possessed. The monk paused, allowing the story to resonate in the quiet space between them. The young person felt something stir within, a faint recognition that this tale was not merely an entertaining parable, but a direct pointer to something real and immediate. The monk continued, his voice gentle but penetrating. "You are like that traveller," he said. "You carry within you a treasure of immeasurable value, but you do not recognize it. You look outside yourself for peace, for happiness, for fulfillment, not realizing that what you seek is already present within you. This treasure is what we call your Buddha nature, your fundamental awareness, your true self. It is not something you need to create or acquire. It is not something you can lose or damage. It is the very ground of your being, always present, always complete, always whole." The young person felt a mixture of hope and skepticism. This teaching sounded beautiful, but how could it be true? If they possessed such a treasure, why did they feel so broken, so incomplete, so fundamentally lacking? The monk seemed to read these thoughts in their expression. "Your doubt is natural," he said. "The mind has been conditioned to believe in its own narratives, its own assessments of reality. You have believed for so long that you are inadequate, that you are broken, that these beliefs have become like a second skin, so familiar that you mistake them for truth. But beliefs are not truth. They are simply thoughts that have been repeated so often that they have gained a false authority. The work of awakening is not about fixing what is broken, because nothing is broken. It is about recognizing what has always been whole." The young person leaned forward, their attention completely focused. "But how?" they asked. "How do I recognize this Buddha nature you speak of? How do I find this treasure within?" The monk smiled. "This is the beautiful paradox of the spiritual path. You cannot find what was never lost. You cannot attain what you already possess. The very seeking creates the illusion of separation from what you seek. It is like a fish swimming through the ocean searching for water. The fish is surrounded by water, living in water, made possible by water, yet it looks everywhere for what it cannot see, because it is too close, too fundamental, too obvious." The young person felt a flash of frustration. "So you're saying there is nothing to do? That I should just accept my suffering?" The monk shook his head gently. "Not at all. I am saying that the doing must come from a different understanding. Right now, you approach spiritual practice as a project of self-improvement, as if you are taking a broken object and trying to repair it. This approach reinforces the very belief that causes suffering, the belief that you are fundamentally inadequate and need to become someone else. True practice begins with a different recognition. It begins with seeing that your essential nature is already perfect, already complete, and that what needs to happen is not transformation, but revelation. You do not need to become the diamond. You need to remove the coverings that prevent you from recognizing that you already are the diamond." The young person sat with these words, feeling them work beneath the surface of understanding. Something in what the monk said resonated at a level deeper than intellectual comprehension, yet the full meaning remained just beyond grasp. The monk stood and gestured for the young person to follow him outside. They walked together through the garden and onto a narrow path that led to a small clearing overlooking the valley below. The view was breathtaking. Mountains stretched into the distance, layer upon layer fading into blue haze, while below them the valley lay in shadow, with the village barely visible as a cluster of buildings beside a stream. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. They stood together in silence, and the monk said softly, "What do you see?" The young person began to describe the landscape, naming the various features, but the monk interrupted gently. No, I do not ask what you can name or describe. I ask what you see before the naming begins, before the mind divides the world into separate objects and concepts. In this moment, before thought, what is present? The young person looked again, trying to see in the way the monk suggested. At first, there was only the familiar habit of mental categorization: mountains, sky, trees, valley. But as they continued to look without trying to capture or define what they saw, something shifted. The boundaries between things became less solid. The observer and the observed seemed less separate. There was simply seeing, simply presence, simply this moment unfolding without any need for interpretation or judgment. In that moment of pure perception, before the mind reasserted its habitual patterns of analysis and judgment, the young person touched something vast and free. It was not dramatic or overwhelming, but rather quiet and natural, like returning home after a long journey. The monk's voice came softly, not interrupting the experience, but rather acknowledging it. This, he said, is a glimpse of your true nature. Not the thoughts about the moment, not the stories you tell yourself, but the direct awareness that is present before thought arises. This awareness is always here, always now, always available. It is not created by special circumstances or spiritual practices. It is the unchanging background against which all experience appears. The moment passed as the mind resumed its ordinary activity, but something had shifted. The young person had experienced, if only briefly, what the monk was pointing toward. It was not a mystical vision or transcendent experience, but rather a simple recognition of something that had always been present but overlooked. As they walked back to the hermitage in the gathering dusk, the young person felt a tentative hope beginning to emerge, different from the desperate grasping that had driven them up the mountain. This hope was quieter, more grounded, arising not from belief in some future attainment, but from a direct taste of present reality. That evening, as they shared another simple meal, the monk spoke about the nature of practice. Many people come to spiritual teaching seeking a technique or method that will solve their problems, he said. They want to know exactly what to do, how many hours to practice, what results to expect. This approach treats spirituality as if it were a craft to be learned or a skill to be developed. But awakening is not like learning to make pottery or play an instrument. It is more like remembering something you have forgotten, or recognizing something that has been in front of you all along. The young person asked, "But surely there must be some practice, some discipline. Otherwise, why do you live here in solitude, following a routine of meditation and study?" The monk nodded. Yes, there is practice, but the practice is not about achieving something. It is about removing obstacles, clearing away the accumulated debris of conditioning, creating space for recognition to occur. Think of it this way. Imagine a mirror that has become covered with dust. The reflective capacity of the mirror does not need to be created or improved. It simply needs to be revealed by removing the dust. Our practices are like the cloth that wipes the mirror clean. They do not add anything to what you are. They remove what obscures what you are. He continued. The fundamental practice is very simple, though not always easy. It is the practice of present moment awareness, of bringing attention to what is actually happening right now, rather than being lost in thoughts about the past or future, rather than being caught in the endless commentary that the mind generates. This practice can take many forms: sitting meditation, mindful movement, conscious work, attentive listening. The form matters less than the quality of attention brought to it. The young person felt both relieved and challenged by this teaching. Relieved because it suggested that the spiritual path was not as complicated or difficult as they had imagined. Challenged because it required something that seemed harder than following complex techniques. It required being present with whatever arose, without the escape of distraction or the comfort of familiar patterns. Over the following days, A routine established itself. Each morning began before dawn, with sitting meditation in the main room of the hermitage. The monk did not give elaborate instructions. He simply said, "Sit comfortably, keep your back straight, and bring your attention to your breath. When you notice that your mind has wandered into thoughts, gently return your attention to the breath. Do this again and again with patience and without judgment." At first, the practice was frustrating. The young person would sit down with good intentions, determined to remain focused, but within seconds the mind would wander off into fantasies, memories, plans, or worries. They would catch themselves and return to the breath, only to find themselves lost in thought again moments later. It seemed impossible to maintain awareness for more than a few seconds at a time. The monk noticed their frustration and spoke about it one morning after meditation. "You are discovering the habitual nature of mind," he said. "For years, perhaps for your entire life, your mind has been conditioned to wander, to seek stimulation, to avoid the present moment. This habit is deeply ingrained. You cannot change it through force or willpower. You change it through patient repetition, through gently bringing your attention back again and again, like training a puppy that keeps running off. Each time you notice that you have wandered and returned to presence, you are strengthening the capacity for awareness. This is the practice." The young person began to notice subtle changes as the days on the mountain accumulated. The racing quality of their thoughts began to slow somewhat, and there were brief moments during meditation when the mind became genuinely quiet, when awareness rested in simple presence without the constant generation of mental commentary. These moments were fleeting, but they revealed something important. The silence and peace they had been seeking were not achievements to be attained through effort, but rather the natural state that emerged when the mind's habitual activity temporarily ceased. One afternoon, as they worked together in the garden, the young person asked the monk about enlightenment. "I have read stories of great masters who achieved sudden awakening, who in one moment of insight saw through all illusion and became permanently established in freedom. Is this what I should be seeking? Will there be a moment when everything suddenly makes sense and suffering ends forever?" The monk paused in his work, leaning on his hoe, and looked at the young person with compassionate amusement. "Ah, the great fantasy of spiritual seeking, the magical moment of transformation after which everything is forever different. This fantasy is one of the most persistent obstacles on the path, because it keeps you oriented toward the future, toward some imagined state of perfection, rather than accepting and working with what is present now." He gestured for them to sit beneath a large tree at the edge of the garden. "Let me tell you another story," he said. "There was once a Zen student who practiced meditation with great dedication for many years. He sat for hours each day, attended intensive retreats, studied sacred texts, and asked his teacher many questions about enlightenment. One day, he approached his teacher and said, 'Master, I have been practicing diligently for 10 years. How much longer until I achieve enlightenment?' The teacher looked at him and said, 'Perhaps another 20 years. The student was shocked and disappointed. 20 years, but I am practicing so hard. What if I practice even harder, meditating twice as long each day? The teacher replied, 'In that case, perhaps 40 years. The student was confused. But that makes no sense. How could practicing more lead to a longer time to enlightenment? The teacher smiled and said, "Each moment you spend thinking about enlightenment as something to be achieved in the future, you move further from the recognition that is available right now. The issue is not how much you practice, but the quality of your understanding. As long as you approach practice as a means to an end, as a project of self-improvement, you reinforce the very sense of lack and incompleteness that causes suffering." The young person absorbed this story, feeling both the truth in it and their resistance to its implications. If enlightenment was not something to be achieved, then what was the point of practice? What were they doing here on this mountain? The monk seemed to sense these thoughts. "The purpose of practice," he said, is not to arrive at some future state, but to wake up to what is true now. Every moment of genuine presence, every instance of clear seeing, every recognition of your true nature, these are not steps on a path to enlightenment. They are enlightenment itself, expressing in this particular moment. The question is not, when will I become enlightened? But rather, am I awake to this moment, or am I lost in thoughts about past and future? He continued, there is a concept in Buddhism called Buddha nature. It teaches that every being already possesses the capacity for awakening, that this capacity is not something external that must be obtained, but rather something intrinsic that must be recognized. Your Buddha nature is like space. It is always present, always available, never damaged or diminished by anything that happens within it. Thoughts, emotions, experiences arise and pass away like clouds in the sky, but the sky itself remains unchanged. Your practice is learning to identify with the sky rather than with the clouds, to recognize yourself as the unchanging awareness within which all experience appears. This teaching struck the young person deeply. They had been so identified with the content of their experience, with their thoughts, emotions, and circumstances, that they had never considered the possibility of a deeper identity, an awareness that witnessed all of this content without being affected by it. How do I find this awareness? They asked. How do I learn to identify with it rather than with my thoughts and emotions? The monk pointed to the young person's chest. Right now, in this moment, are you aware? Is there consciousness present? Do not analyze or think about it. Simply notice. Is awareness present? The young person paused, turning attention inward. Yes, obviously there was awareness. How else would they be hearing the monk's words, seeing the garden, feeling the warmth of the sun? Yes, they said. There is awareness. The monk nodded. That awareness, prior to any content, prior to any thought or sensation, that is what you are. Not the thoughts that appear in awareness, not the emotions that arise and pass, not the body that you can observe and feel, but the observing itself, the awareness itself. This is your Buddha nature, your true self. The teaching about awareness as the fundamental reality began to work in the young person's understanding, like yeast in bread, gradually expanding and transforming their perspective. During the following days, they tried to maintain contact with this awareness, to recognize it as the silent witness behind all experience. It was elusive at first, like trying to see your own eyes without a mirror, but gradually they developed a capacity to step back from thoughts and emotions and recognize the awareness in which they appeared. One evening, as they sat together watching the sun set, the monk spoke about the nature of suffering. You came to me, he said, seeking relief from suffering. But have you considered what suffering actually is? Not the various circumstances you find unpleasant, but the essential quality of suffering itself. What creates the experience of psychological pain? The young person reflected. I suppose suffering is when things are not the way I want them to be. When I fail, when others reject me, when circumstances are difficult. The monk shook his head gently. Those are the occasions for suffering, but not suffering itself. Many people face failure, rejection, and difficulty without suffering. Others suffer intensely even when external circumstances are quite favorable. The suffering is not in the circumstances, but in the relationship to circumstances, in the resistance to what is. He elaborated. Suffering arises from the gap between how things are and how the mind insists they should be. It arises from attachment to pleasure and aversion to pain, from grasping and rejection, from the constant evaluation of experience as either desirable or undesirable. The mind creates an image of how life should be, and when reality does not conform to this image, suffering results. This is why the Buddha taught that attachment is the root of suffering. Attachment here does not mean caring about things or enjoying experience. It means the clinging, the insistence that things be different than they are, the inability to accept the flowing, changing nature of reality. The young person listened carefully. This teaching was beginning to illuminate their own experience. They recognized how much energy they spent resisting what was actually happening, arguing with reality, wishing things were different. Even in moments of pleasure, there was often an underlying anxiety about the experience ending, a grasping to hold on to what was naturally flowing away. So how do I stop this resistance? They asked. How do I stop creating suffering? The monk smiled. The very question contains the problem. You ask, how do I stop? As if you could force yourself into non-resistance through will and effort. But this approach simply creates another form of resistance. Resistance to your own resistance. You end up in an impossible battle. Trying to force yourself to stop forcing, trying to make yourself accept what you cannot accept. This is why spiritual striving often creates more suffering rather than less. He paused, allowing this to sink in. The way out of this paradox is through understanding, not through effort. As you see more clearly how suffering is created, as you recognize in real time the moment when the mind begins to grasp or reject, the hold of these patterns naturally weakens. You cannot force yourself to let go, but letting go happens naturally when you see clearly that grasping causes pain. It is like holding a hot coal. You do not need to force yourself to drop it. The moment you clearly perceive that holding it causes burning, the hand opens by itself. Over the following days, the young person began to observe their own mental patterns with this quality of interested attention rather than judgment or force. They noticed how quickly the mind moved to evaluate experience as good or bad, desirable or undesirable. They observed the subtle ways they tried to hold on to pleasant experiences and push away unpleasant ones. And they began to see how this constant evaluation and manipulation created a low-level tension that colored all of experience. One morning during meditation, something shifted. The young person was sitting quietly, watching the breath, when a strong emotion arose, a wave of sadness, without any apparent cause. The habitual response would have been to either push the emotion away, to distract themselves from it, or to get caught up in thinking about why they felt sad. But in this moment, perhaps because of the practice of the previous days, they simply observed the sadness arising, noticed the sensations in the chest and throat, watched the thoughts that accompanied the emotion without buying into any of it, without trying to change it. The sadness was simply allowed to be present, held in the spacious awareness that they had been learning to recognize. And something remarkable happened. Without being pushed away or grasped, without being fed by identification and story, the sadness simply moved through. It arose, peaked, and passed away, like a wave in the ocean, leaving behind a clarity and openness that felt natural and free. After meditation, the young person excitedly described this experience to the monk. He nodded, clearly pleased. "This is an important recognition," he said. "You have discovered that you are not your emotions, that you can allow them to be present without being overwhelmed by them. This is the beginning of true freedom, not freedom from emotions, but freedom within emotions. The recognition that awareness is spacious enough to hold all experience without being diminished or damaged by it." As the weeks on the mountain unfolded, the young person's understanding deepened through a combination of formal practice, work, conversation with the monk, and the simple rhythm of life in this remote place. They began to appreciate the wisdom in the monk's insistence on maintaining simple daily routines, tending the garden, preparing meals, cleaning, and maintaining the hermitage. These ordinary activities, when performed with attention and care, became a form of meditation, opportunities to practice presence and to notice the quality of mind brought to each moment. One afternoon, while washing dishes, the young person had an insight. They noticed that when the mind was fully engaged with the simple act of washing, feeling the warm water, seeing the soap bubbles, sensing the movement of hands, There was a natural contentment, a quiet joy that needed nothing added to it. But when the mind wandered into thoughts about the future or judgments about whether this task was valuable or meaningful, the experience became burdensome, something to get through rather than something to be present with. The monk, observing them from across the room, seemed to notice this recognition. "You are discovering the secret of contentment," he said. "It is not found in circumstances, but in the quality of attention." The present moment, when met directly without the filter of conceptual thought, without constant evaluation and comparison, is inherently satisfying. The restlessness and dissatisfaction you have experienced in your life is not because your circumstances were wrong, but because you were not fully present to any of them, always thinking about what was missing, what should be different, what might come next. That evening, the monk told another story. There was a Zen master who was known for his deep peace and contentment. A student came to him and said, "Master, what is the secret of your happiness? You have so little. Just a small room, simple food, old robes. You have no family, no possessions, no worldly success. Yet you seem more content than wealthy people I know who have everything. What is your secret?" The master replied, "When I sit, I sit. When I walk, I walk. When I eat, I eat. When I sleep, I sleep." The student was confused. "But master, everyone does these things. What is special about your way?" The master smiled and said, "When most people sit, they are already walking. When they walk, they are already somewhere else. When they eat, they are planning. When they sleep, they are reviewing. They are never where they are, always somewhere else in their minds. This is why they suffer. I simply do what I am doing, completely, without division. This is the secret." The young person felt both the simplicity and the profundity of this teaching. It pointed to something so basic, so obvious, yet so consistently missed in ordinary life. The constant flight from the present moment, the endless seeking for something better somewhere else, was the very thing that prevented the peace and contentment that was available right now. As their time on the mountain extended, the young person began to notice changes, not just in their understanding, but in their direct experience. The racing quality of mind that had characterized their life in the village began to settle. There were longer periods of genuine calm, moments when the mental commentary simply ceased, and there was only direct experience, the sound of wind, the sight of clouds moving across the sky, the sensation of breath, the taste of food. These moments were not dramatic or ecstatic, but they had a quality of completeness, of being enough that was deeply satisfying. One day the monk introduced a new element into the teachings. They were sitting together in the main room when he said, "So far, we have talked much about awareness, about presence, about letting go of resistance. These are foundational teachings. But there is another dimension to the path that must be understood and cultivated. This is the dimension of compassion." The young person listened attentively as the monk continued. When you begin to recognize your true nature, when you touch the peace and freedom of unconditioned awareness, there can be a temptation to use this recognition as an escape from the world, to retreat into a kind of detached observation where you are no longer touched by suffering, neither your own nor that of others. This is a subtle trap, a spiritual bypassing that uses the teachings to avoid rather than engage with the full reality of being human. He leaned forward, his eyes intense despite their gentleness. True awakening does not lead away from the world, but deeper into it, not into more separation, but into more connection, not into less feeling, but into more profound feeling that is not distorted by self-centeredness. As you recognize that your essential nature is not separate from others, that the awareness looking through your eyes is the same awareness looking through all eyes, compassion arises naturally. You begin to see that the suffering of others is not fundamentally different from your own, that all beings are seeking happiness and trying to avoid pain, using whatever understanding and means they have available. The monk stood and walked to the window, looking out over the valley. There is a teaching in Buddhism about the Bodhisattva, the awakening being who vows to work for the liberation of all beings before entering final nirvana. This is not just a beautiful ideal, it points to a profound truth that genuine freedom includes the recognition that we are not separate, that your welfare and the welfare of all beings are not two different things. The teaching about compassion opened a new dimension in the young person's understanding. They had been so focused on their own suffering, so consumed by their personal struggle for peace and freedom, that they had not fully considered the suffering of others except as it impacted them directly. Now, as their own inner turmoil began to settle through practice and insight, there was more space to actually perceive the struggles and pain of other beings without immediately filtering everything through self-centered concerns. The monk sensed that this teaching was taking root and decided to develop it further. Compassion, he said one morning, is often misunderstood. People think of it as a kind of emotional sentimentality, a feeling of pity for those who suffer. But true compassion is not primarily an emotion. It is a recognition of shared being, a knowing that the apparent boundaries between self and other are ultimately illusory. When this recognition is clear, compassion is not something you try to cultivate or generate. It simply flows naturally, like water finding its level. He poured tea as he spoke, the simple action somehow illustrating his words. Think of it this way. If you cut your hand, you do not debate about whether to care for it. You do not need to generate feelings of compassion toward your hand. The caring happens immediately and naturally because you recognize the hand as part of yourself. As your sense of self expands to include others, as the rigid boundary between me and not me becomes more porous and transparent, caring for others becomes as natural as caring for your own hand. The young person asked, "But how does this expansion happen? How do I move from the narrow self-concern that has characterized my life to this larger sense of connection?" The monk smiled. "It happens through the same practices we have been discussing: presence, awareness, letting go of conceptual overlay. The separate self, the ego that feels isolated and defended, is not your true nature. It is a construct, a thought-created pattern of identification. As you see through this construct, as you recognize your essential nature as boundless awareness rather than limited body-mind, the artificial boundaries naturally dissolve. You begin to experience directly what the teachings have always pointed toward: that consciousness is not contained within your skull, that awareness is not personal property, that the life force flowing through you is the same life flowing through all beings." He continued, "There is a practice that can support this recognition. It is called metta, or loving-kindness practice. It is simple but profound. You begin by directing kind intentions toward yourself. May I be happy. May I be healthy. May I be safe. May I live with ease. Then you expand this field of well-wishing to include others. First people you care about, then neutral people, then difficult people, and finally all beings without exception. The practice is not about generating artificial feelings, but about removing the barriers that prevent the natural flow of kindness that is already present in awareness." That evening, the young person tried this practice during meditation. They began by directing kind intentions toward themselves, but immediately encountered resistance. The mind generated thoughts like, "I don't deserve happiness," and "This feels selfish." The monk had warned about this resistance, explaining that many people found it easier to wish well for others than for themselves, having internalized harsh judgments and self-criticism. The young person persisted, gently repeating the phrases while noticing the resistance without buying into it. Gradually, something softened. There was a tentative opening, a possibility that perhaps they could include themselves in the circle of care and concern that they more readily extended to others. From there, they moved to thinking of people they cared about, friends and family members, and wished for their happiness and well-being. This felt more natural, more emotionally accessible. Then they brought to mind someone neutral, a shopkeeper from the village they had passed many times without much thought. Trying to wish genuine well-being for this person revealed how usually the mind divided the world into categories. People who mattered and people who were merely background. People whose happiness concerned them and people they barely registered as having inner lives. Finally, they attempted to include someone difficult, a person who had hurt or disappointed them. This was challenging, bringing up feelings of resentment and justification for withholding kindness. But the practice invited them to see beyond the hurt, to recognize that this difficult person, like everyone, was also struggling, also seeking happiness in unskillful ways, also worthy of compassion despite their flaws and mistakes. After the meditation, the young person felt different, softer somehow, less defended, more connected to the web of life that included all beings. They shared this experience with the monk, who nodded with understanding. You are beginning to see that the path of awakening is not a path of isolation or detachment, but a path of ever-deepening connection. As the false self dissolves, what remains is not nothing but everything, not emptiness devoid of content, but emptiness that is paradoxically full, pregnant with all possibility, intimately connected with all that exists. The days continued to unfold in their gentle rhythm, and the young person found themselves settling more deeply into the practice and the teachings. One morning, the monk introduced a new topic, one that would prove challenging to understand. Today, he said, I want to speak with you about emptiness, what in Sanskrit is called shunyata. This is one of the most profound and most easily misunderstood teachings in Buddhism. Many people hear the word emptiness and think it means nothingness, that Buddhism teaches that nothing exists or nothing matters. This is a complete misunderstanding. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Emptiness does not mean that things do not exist. It means that things do not exist in the way we usually think they do. We perceive the world as composed of separate, solid, permanent objects with fixed identities. We think of ourselves as a separate, solid, permanent self with a fixed identity. But this perception, while it appears obvious and undeniable, is actually a mental construction, a way of organizing and interpreting experience that is useful in some contexts, but ultimately not true to the actual nature of reality. The young person struggled to follow this. But surely things exist. I can see the table, touch it, know it is solid and real. How can you say it doesn't exist as I perceive it? The monk nodded, expecting this response. Look at the table more carefully. What is it actually? Is it the wood? But the wood came from a tree, and the tree came from a seed, and the seed came from another tree, and so on back through time. Where does the table begin and the tree end? Is it the carpenter who shaped it? Without the carpenter, there would be no table. Is it the design in the carpenter's mind? Is it the tools used to cut and join the wood? Is it the people who bought and used it, giving it meaning and purpose? The table has no existence independent of all these factors. It is a temporary coming together of elements, a point of intersection of countless causes and conditions, but it has no inherent, separate existence apart from all of this. The young person's mind reeled. This way of seeing was so different from the ordinary perception of solid, separate objects. The monk continued, This is true of everything, including your sense of self. You think of yourself as a solid, continuous entity that has existed from birth and will continue until death. But what are you actually? Are you your body? But the body is constantly changing, cells dying and being replaced, atoms flowing through in a continuous stream. The body you have now shares almost no matter with the body you had 7 years ago. Are you your thoughts? But thoughts arise and pass away continuously. Which thought is the real you? Are you your memories? But memories are constantly being revised and rewritten, and many of your memories are actually false, constructed by the mind without your awareness. Are you your personality? But personality changes over time, sometimes dramatically. The child you were, the adult you are now, the elder you will become, which is the real you? This questioning was deeply unsettling. The young person felt the ground of ordinary understanding begin to shake. If they were not their body, not their thoughts, not their memories, not their personality, then what were they? The monk saw the disturbance this teaching was causing and spoke gently. Do not be frightened by this inquiry. The dissolution of the solid sense of self is not a loss, but a liberation. What dies is not you, but only a false idea of you. What remains is something vast and free, not limited by the boundaries of a separate self. He stood and gestured for the young person to follow him outside. They walked in silence through the forest, the monk occasionally pointing to various things, a flower, a bird, a stone, without speaking. Finally, they came to a small pond, its surface perfectly still, reflecting the sky and trees. Look at the reflection, the monk said. Is it real? Does it exist? The young person looked at the reflected trees and sky shimmering on the water's surface. It exists as a reflection, they said, but it's not solid or permanent. If the water moves or the light changes, the reflection changes or disappears. The monk nodded. Yes, and this is how all phenomena exist, not as solid, permanent, separate things, but as reflections, as appearances arising from the interplay of countless conditions, empty of inherent existence, yet undeniably present in experience. The teaching of emptiness does not deny the existence of the reflection. It simply points to the nature of the reflection, dependently arisen, impermanent, without separate self-existence. They sat together by the pond, watching the reflections shift as gentle breezes moved across the water. The young person began to see that emptiness did not mean nothingness, but rather a different way of understanding existence, not as composed of separate, solid things, but as a flowing, interconnected process, everything arising in dependence on everything else, nothing existing in isolation, all forms empty of separate selfhood, while still appearing and functioning in the world of experience. The teaching about emptiness continued to work in the young person's awareness over the following days, sometimes creating confusion, sometimes opening into moments of clear seeing. The monk was patient with this process, knowing that such profound teachings could not be grasped intellectually, but had to be slowly absorbed through contemplation and direct experience. One evening, as they sat together after the day's work, the monk told another story. There was a Zen practitioner who was carrying water in a bucket. As he walked, he looked down and saw the reflection of the moon in the water. It was beautiful, luminous, perfect. He became very careful, trying not to spill any water, trying to preserve the precious moon reflection. But then he stumbled, and the bucket fell, spilling all the water on the ground. The practitioner looked down, expecting to feel disappointment, but instead he experienced a moment of profound liberation. With the water spilled and the reflection gone, he looked up and saw the moon itself, vast and radiant in the sky. He realized that he had been so focused on preserving the reflection that he had forgotten to look at what was being reflected. In that moment, he understood the teaching of emptiness. All the forms we cling to are like reflections in water, beautiful but insubstantial. And when we lose our grip on these reflections, we discover what was there all along, the vast radiance of true nature. The young person felt something resonate deeply with this story. They had been so focused on trying to improve their life, on acquiring peace and happiness, on preserving pleasant experiences and avoiding unpleasant ones, that they had missed what was already present, the awareness itself, the consciousness within which all experience arose, the moon that was never contained in or limited to any particular reflection. The monk sensed that this teaching was landing. This is why we practice letting go, he said, not because forms and experiences are bad or wrong, but because clinging to them, trying to make them solid and permanent, prevents us from recognizing what is always present, never changing, never threatened by the flowing and changing of experience. You do not need to reject your life or your experiences. You need to see their true nature, empty of separate existence, yet luminous, functional, and appearing in awareness. As the weeks turned into months, the young person's practice deepened. The formal sitting meditation became more stable, with longer periods of genuine stillness and clarity. But perhaps more importantly, the quality of mindfulness began to extend into daily activities. They became more aware of the patterns of thought and emotion that arose throughout the day, more able to recognize these patterns without being carried away by them. One particular pattern became very clear: the habit of constant evaluation and comparison. The mind seemed to have an ongoing commentary about everything. This is good, that is bad. I like this, I don't like that. This is better than that. I am better than them. I am worse than them. This constant judging and measuring created a pervasive sense of unease, a feeling that nothing was ever quite right as it was, that everything needed to be improved, changed, or different. The young person brought this observation to the monk, who smiled with recognition. Yes, this is one of the most deeply ingrained habits of the unexamined mind, the constant evaluation of experience. The mind has been conditioned to believe that its job is to judge and categorize everything, to maintain a constant sense of control through this evaluative process. But this habit is exhausting and ultimately futile. The judgments do not change reality. They only color your experience of reality, adding an unnecessary layer of suffering to what is already present. He continued, "The practice is not to force yourself to stop judging. That would just be another form of judgment, but to become aware of the judging as it happens, to see it clearly as a mental habit rather than truth, and to rest in the awareness that is prior to judgment. When you see a beautiful sunset before the mind says beautiful, there is a moment of direct perception, of immediate experience before it is labeled and categorized. Learning to rest in that preconceptual awareness, even briefly, begins to free you from the tyranny of constant evaluation." The young person tried to practice this awareness of preconceptual perception. It was subtle and challenging, requiring a very precise attention to catch the gap between experience and thought, between seeing and labeling. But occasionally they would glimpse it, a moment of pure perception before the mind's interpretive machinery kicked in, before the experience was packaged into concepts and judgments. These moments had a quality of freshness and immediacy that was lost once thinking began. One day, something shifted more fundamentally. The young person was sweeping the floor of the hermitage, engaged in this simple, repetitive task, when suddenly the sense of being a separate self doing the sweeping dropped away. There was just sweeping happening, just movement and sensation and awareness, but no separate I at the center of it all. It lasted only a moment before the familiar sense of self reasserted itself. But in that moment, there was a taste of what the teachings had been pointing toward, the possibility of functioning, of living, of engaging with life without the constant burden of self-consciousness, without the heavy sense of a separate self that needed to be protected, improved, and defended. The experience of selfless sweeping marked a turning point in the young person's practice. It was brief, barely a few seconds, but it revealed something that words and concepts could not fully convey: the actual possibility of experiencing life without the constant filter of self-centeredness. When they described this experience to the monk, his eyes lit up with genuine pleasure. "This is a significant moment," he said. "You have touched directly what we have been discussing conceptually. The separate self is not an entity that exists and must be destroyed or eliminated. It is a pattern of thought, a habit of identifying with particular experiences and claiming them as mine. When that pattern temporarily ceases, as it did during your sweeping, what remains is not nothing but everything, just pure experiencing without the contraction around a separate experiencer." The monk stood and began to pace slowly, his hands folded behind his back. This is what we mean by anatta, or no self, in Buddhism. It is one of the most misunderstood teachings because it seems to contradict obvious experience. Of course there is a self. I think, I feel, I act. But look more carefully. When you say, I think, you are claiming ownership of thoughts that arise on their own, without your conscious control. Did you decide what thought would appear next in your mind? Can you stop thoughts from arising? When you say, I feel, you are identifying with emotions that appear based on countless causes and conditions, most of which you are not aware of and did not choose. The sense of being a separate self that owns and controls experience is itself just another experience arising in awareness, not the fundamental truth of what you are. The young person struggled with this teaching. But if there is no self, who is practicing? Who is seeking awakening? Who will be liberated? The monk smiled, recognizing the ancient question. This is the paradox that has confused seekers for millennia. There must be enough sense of personal agency to motivate practice, to make effort, to maintain discipline. Yet the ultimate realization reveals that the separate self you were trying to improve or enlighten was itself part of the illusion. Here is the key. You use the sense of self as a tool for practice, while simultaneously investigating its nature and seeing through its apparent solidity. It is like using a thorn to remove another thorn, and then discarding both thorns. You use the apparent self to investigate the nature of self, and in the process of investigation, both the investigator and the investigated are seen through. He sat down again, his voice becoming softer, more intimate. In practical terms, this means you continue to practice, continue to live responsibly, continue to make choices and take actions, but with a growing recognition that all of this is happening within awareness. That the actor and the action are not two separate things, but aspects of one seamless process. You function as if there is a self, while knowing that the self is empty of inherent existence. This is what is meant by living in the world while not being of the world, by acting without attachment to being an actor. The teaching about no self was challenging and somewhat destabilizing, requiring the young person to question assumptions so deep they had never been examined. But it also brought a strange sense of relief. If the self was not as solid and permanent as it appeared, if it was more like a flowing process than a fixed entity, then perhaps it was not as vulnerable as it seemed. Perhaps the constant anxiety about protecting and improving this self could relax somewhat. Over the next several days, the monk introduced teachings about karma and rebirth, explaining them in a way that was free from superstition or belief, but grounded in observable cause and effect. Karma, he said, simply means action and its consequences. Every action you take, every word you speak, every thought you think has effects that ripple outward, shaping your experience and the experience of others. This is not a mystical law enforced by some cosmic judge. It is simply how reality works. Actions have consequences. He elaborated. The quality of your intentions shapes your actions, and your actions shape your experience. If you act from greed, hatred, and delusion, the consequences of those actions will generally create suffering for yourself and others. If you act from generosity, compassion, and wisdom, the consequences will generally create well-being. This is karma, not fate or predetermination, but the natural unfolding of cause and effect in the moral dimension of life. The young person asked about rebirth, a teaching that seemed difficult to accept without religious faith. The monk responded thoughtfully. Rebirth can be understood at different levels. At the most literal level, it refers to the cycle of death and rebirth that consciousness undergoes across multiple lifetimes. Whether you accept this literally depends on your experience and understanding. But rebirth can also be understood psychologically, as the constant death and rebirth of the self from moment to moment. The person you were yesterday has died, and a new person has been born today, shaped by yesterday's actions and thoughts, but not identical to yesterday's self. In this sense, rebirth is not something that happens after death, but something that is happening continuously throughout your life. He continued, the liberation that Buddhism points toward is liberation from this cycle, not by escaping life, but by seeing through the illusion that keeps the cycle going. What keeps you bound is ignorance of your true nature, the belief in a separate, permanent self that must be preserved and protected. When this ignorance is replaced by wisdom, when you recognize your nature as boundless awareness rather than limited self, the desperate clinging that drives the cycle of suffering naturally releases. As the season changed and the air grew cooler, the young person reflected on how much had shifted since their arrival at the hermitage. The desperate seeking that had driven them up the mountain had transformed into something quieter and more spacious, not the absence of intention or aspiration, but a different quality of engagement with the path, less driven by fear and lack, more motivated by genuine interest and love of truth. One morning, the monk spoke about the integration of practice into daily life. Many people think of spiritual practice as something separate from ordinary life, something you do in special places or at special times. They sit on the meditation cushion for an hour and then return to their habitual patterns of reactivity and unconsciousness for the rest of the day. This division between practice and life prevents genuine transformation. The ultimate aim is for your entire life to become practice, for every moment to be an opportunity for awareness and awakening. The young person asked, "But how is this possible? I cannot maintain meditation awareness while working, while talking with others, while engaging in complex activities." The monk shook his head. "You misunderstand what I mean by practice. I am not suggesting that you maintain the same quality of attention you bring to sitting meditation during all activities. That would be neither possible nor appropriate. Different situations call for different qualities of attention. What I mean is that you bring consciousness to whatever you are doing, that you remain aware of your state of mind, your intentions, your reactions. This does not require formal meditation. It requires being present, being honest with yourself, catching yourself when you fall into unconscious patterns, and gently bringing yourself back to awareness." He illustrated with an example. Suppose someone speaks to you harshly, criticizing or attacking you. The habitual unconscious response might be to immediately defend yourself, to attack back, to feel wounded and resentful. But if you have cultivated awareness, you can catch this reaction as it begins to arise. You notice the sensation in your body, the tightening in your chest, the thought patterns of defense and justification beginning to form. In that moment of noticing, you have a choice. You do not have to act out the habitual pattern. You can pause, breathe, recognize that the other person is suffering and acting from their own pain, and choose a response that is more conscious and compassionate. This is practice in daily life, not formal meditation, but aware living. The young person could see the truth and importance of this teaching. They had often noticed how they could maintain a certain clarity and peace during formal meditation, but then lose it immediately when encountering difficult situations in daily life. The monk was pointing to a way of extending the quality of awareness cultivated in meditation into all aspects of life. There is a traditional teaching about the 6 paramitas, the monk continued, which are qualities or practices that lead to awakening. They are generosity, ethical conduct, patience, energy, meditation, and wisdom. These are not separate practices, but different expressions of an awakened life. Generosity is not just about giving material things, but about offering your presence, your attention, your kindness freely. Ethical conduct is not about following rigid rules, but about living in harmony with the reality of interconnection, not causing unnecessary harm. Patience is the capacity to be present with difficulty without reactivity. Energy is the wholehearted engagement with life, not held back by doubt or hesitation. Meditation is the ongoing cultivation of awareness and concentration. Wisdom is the direct seeing of the true nature of reality. All of these work together, supporting and reinforcing each other, creating a life that is an expression of awakening rather than a search for it. Over the following days, the young person contemplated each of these qualities, seeing how they were all interconnected and how deficiency in one area affected the others. They noticed, for instance, how impatience created ethical lapses. When they were not willing to bear discomfort, they would sometimes speak harshly or act selfishly to escape the discomfort quickly. They saw how lack of energy in practice led to less wisdom, as the mind remained cloudy and unclear. They recognized how little true generosity they had embodied, how much of their giving had been motivated by expectation of return or desire for approval, rather than genuine open-heartedness. One afternoon, a visitor came to the hermitage, a wealthy merchant who had heard of the monk's wisdom and sought advice about a business dilemma. The young person observed as the monk listened carefully to the merchant's elaborate explanation of his situation, nodding occasionally, asking clarifying questions. When the merchant finally finished and asked for guidance, the monk was silent for a long moment. Then he said simply, "You already know what is right to do. The question is whether you have the courage to do it." The merchant seemed taken aback, perhaps expecting a more elaborate response. But as he sat with the monk's words, his face changed, moving through several expressions before settling into a kind of resigned acceptance. "You are right," he said finally. "I do know. I just wanted permission to avoid the difficult choice. But I cannot." After the merchant left, the young person asked the monk about the interaction. "How did you know what advice to give him? You didn't tell him specifically what to do." The monk smiled. "I did not need to tell him what to do because he already knew. His elaborate explanation of his dilemma was actually an attempt to obscure his own clarity, to create confusion where there was actually clear knowing. Most people who seek advice are not really looking for wisdom from outside. They are looking for permission to avoid what they already know they should do, or they are looking for someone else to take responsibility for a decision they do not want to own. My role was simply to reflect his own knowing back to him." This exchange taught the young person something important about wisdom. It was not primarily a matter of accumulating knowledge or learning answers to questions. It was more about clearing away the obscurations that prevented one's own innate wisdom from functioning clearly. The monk often said that everyone possessed wisdom already, that it was inherent in awareness itself, but that this wisdom was covered over by layers of conditioning, confusion, and self-deception. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the monk spoke about death. "Death is the great teacher," he said, "though most people treat it as the great enemy. They spend their lives avoiding the thought of death, pretending it will not happen, or believing that it is so far in the future that it need not concern them now. But this avoidance creates a fundamental dishonesty that distorts everything else. When you truly accept that death is inevitable and that its timing is uncertain, when you let this truth penetrate beneath intellectual acknowledgement into felt reality, everything changes. Your priorities shift, your appreciation of life deepens, and your willingness to waste time on trivial concerns diminishes." The young person felt a chill at these words. They had rarely thought about death directly. Having the young person sense that death was something that happened to old people far in the future. But the monk's words pierced through this comfortable denial. "I do not say this to frighten you," the monk continued, "but to awaken you. Imagine that you knew with certainty that you would die 1 month from now. How would you live differently? What would suddenly become important? What would you stop wasting time on? What relationships would you repair? What words would you finally speak? What experiences would you prioritize? Now ask yourself, why are you waiting? What makes you think you have more than a month? The truth is, you have no idea how much time you have. Death could come tomorrow, next week, next year, or 50 years from now. Living as if you have infinite time is a form of delusion that prevents you from fully engaging with the life you have right now." These words shook something loose in the young person. They realized how much of their life had been lived in a kind of postponement, always assuming there would be time later to really live, to really practice, to really love. They had been saving their full engagement for some future moment when conditions would be better, when they would be more ready, when the time would be right. But what if there was no perfect future moment? What if this imperfect present moment was all they truly had? The monk let this teaching settle before continuing. There is a meditation practice in Buddhism called Maranasati, or death meditation. It involves contemplating the inevitability of death, the unpredictability of its timing, and the absolute certainty that at death you cannot take anything with you, no possessions, no achievements, no relationships, nothing except the qualities of mind you have cultivated. This practice is not morbid or depressing when approached correctly. It is liberating because it cuts through the endless deferral and avoidance that characterizes most people's lives. It brings urgency and appreciation to each moment. That night, lying in their room, the young person contemplated their own death, for perhaps the first time with genuine attention. They imagined the moment when breath would cease, when consciousness would fade, when this body that seemed so solid and permanent would become cold and lifeless. The contemplation brought up fear, certainly, but also something unexpected, a profound appreciation for being alive right now, for the simple fact of breathing, of seeing, of experiencing this moment. They realized how much they had taken for granted, how much they had failed to appreciate because they were always looking ahead to the next thing, always assuming there would be more. The next morning, something had shifted in the quality of the young person's presence. There was less sense of hurry, less of the driven quality that had characterized their practice. Instead, there was a gentle intensity, a full engagement with each moment, not because they were trying to achieve something, but because this moment was what they actually had. The monk noticed this shift and nodded approvingly, but said nothing. Over the following weeks, several more teachings were offered, each one adding another facet to the young person's understanding. The monk spoke about right speech, explaining how words had power to harm or heal, to create clarity or confusion. He taught about the importance of honesty, not just in the obvious sense of not lying, but in the deeper sense of being truthful about your actual experience, your actual understanding, your actual state of mind. He spoke about the danger of spiritual pretension, of claiming understanding you did not have, of adopting the appearance of wisdom without the substance. The teaching about honesty struck particularly deep. The young person began to notice how often they had been dishonest, not necessarily in obvious lies, but in subtle misrepresentations of their experience. They would claim to understand teachings they did not really understand. They would pretend to be more peaceful or more advanced than they actually were. They would hide their doubts and struggles, maintaining an image of being a good practitioner. The monk addressed this directly one day. The spiritual path requires radical honesty, he said. You must be willing to see yourself clearly, including all the parts you would prefer to hide or deny. This is not about self-judgment or self-criticism. It is about accuracy, about seeing what is actually true rather than what you wish were true or what you think should be true. Most people construct an idealized self-image and then spend enormous energy trying to defend and maintain this image. But this image is a prison that prevents genuine development. He continued, when you can be honest about where you actually are, acknowledging your confusion, your doubts, your reactive patterns, your limitations, then you can work with what is actually present rather than what you pretend is present. This honesty is deeply liberating. You no longer have to maintain exhausting pretenses. You can simply be as you are, neither inflating yourself nor denigrating yourself, just acknowledging the truth of your current experience. The young person took this teaching to heart and began to practice a more ruthless honesty with themselves. When they noticed judgment arising, they acknowledged it rather than pretending to be non-judgmental. When they felt angry or afraid, they admitted it rather than covering it with spiritual platitudes. When they did not understand something, They said so rather than nodding sagely. This honesty was uncomfortable at first, feeling like exposure of inadequacy. But gradually it became liberating, creating a solid ground of truth from which genuine development could occur. One day, the monk introduced the concept of the middle way, one of the Buddha's central teachings. The Buddha taught that the path to awakening lies between the extremes of self-indulgence and self-mortification. This teaching has many levels of meaning. At the most obvious level, it means that you do not need to torture yourself or engage in extreme ascetic practices to awaken, but neither should you simply indulge every impulse and desire. But at a deeper level, it points to a balanced relationship with all aspects of experience, neither grasping at pleasure nor fleeing from pain, neither inflating the ego nor trying to destroy it, neither losing yourself in the world nor withdrawing from it completely. He elaborated. Many people swing between extremes in their practice. They practice intensely for a time, full of enthusiasm and determination, but then they burn out and swing to the other extreme of complete laziness and indulgence. Or they are very strict and disciplined, but this strictness becomes rigid and joyless, another form of suffering. The middle way suggests a sustainable, balanced approach, consistent but not rigid, dedicated but not driven, sincere but not grim. The young person recognized this pattern in their own practice. They had come to the mountain in a state of desperate seeking, ready to do whatever it took, to make any sacrifice, to practice with extreme intensity. But the monk's teaching and the gentle routine of life at the hermitage had gradually introduced them to a different way. Steady, consistent, thorough but not frantic, serious but not heavy. As winter approached and the air grew colder, the rhythm of life at the hermitage adjusted. More time was spent indoors, and the monk used the long evenings to tell stories of great teachers and practitioners from the past. These stories were not just entertainment, but teaching tools, each one illustrating some aspect of the path or some quality of awakened being. There was the story of Milarepa, who spent years living in caves, practicing with such intensity that his skin turned green from eating only nettles. There was the story of Dogen, who emphasized just sitting, without goal or attainment, simply being present with what is. There was the story of Bodhidharma, who sat facing a wall for 9 years, deepening into stillness until realization bloomed. There were stories of contemporary teachers, ordinary people who had awakened to their true nature through various means, some through intense practice, others through sudden shock, others through the gradual wearing away of delusion through consistent awareness. Each story revealed something about the many forms the path could take, the various ways that human beings could wake up from the dream of separation. The young person absorbed these stories, seeing in them both inspiration and teaching. What struck them most was the diversity of paths and practices, the recognition that there was no single right way but many ways, each suited to different temperaments and circumstances. This was liberating because it freed them from the anxiety of making sure they were doing it exactly right. There was a rightness that was unique to each person's path, discovered not by following external formulas, but by paying attention to what actually worked, what actually brought clarity and freedom. One particularly cold evening, as snow began to fall outside, the monk spoke about joy. One of the misconceptions about the spiritual path is that it is grim and serious, all about discipline and renunciation and giving up pleasure. While it is true that the path requires discipline and involves letting go of certain forms of grasping, the ultimate fruit of practice is not more suffering, but less, not less joy, but more. The joy that comes from awakening is not dependent on external circumstances. It is the natural radiance of awareness when it is not constricted by fear and grasping. The teaching about joy opened up a dimension of practice that the young person had not fully considered. They had approached the spiritual path primarily as a way to escape suffering, to find relief from the anxiety and dissatisfaction that had plagued them. But the monk was pointing to something more positive, not just the absence of suffering, but the presence of genuine well-being, a joy that was intrinsic to awakened consciousness. Think about the times when you have been truly happy, the monk said. Not just pleased or satisfied, but deeply happy, filled with a sense of well-being that needs nothing added to it. If you examine these moments carefully, you often find that they occur when the mind is quiet, when you are fully present, when the usual sense of separation and self-concern has temporarily dropped away. Perhaps you are in nature, absorbed in beauty. Perhaps you are completely engaged in some activity, losing yourself in the flow of it. Perhaps you are in a moment of deep connection with another being. What all these moments have in common is the absence of the contracted, defended, separate self and its constant concerns. The young person reflected on this and recognized its truth. The moments of genuine happiness in their life had indeed been moments when the usual self-concern had temporarily ceased, when there was just experience without the filter of constant evaluation and self-reference. This is the great paradox, the monk continued. The self you spend so much energy protecting and promoting is actually the main obstacle to the happiness you seek. The freedom and joy you long for are found not in strengthening and satisfying this self, but in seeing through it, in recognizing its insubstantial, constructed nature. When the rigid boundaries of self soften and become transparent, when you recognize your nature as boundless awareness rather than limited body-mind, what emerges naturally is joy, love, and compassion, not as achievements, but as your fundamental nature finally allowed to express itself. As the winter deepened, the practice at the hermitage became more intensive. The days were shorter, the nights longer, and there was more time for sitting meditation. The young person found that their practice had gained a certain momentum, a continuity that made it easier to settle into awareness. What had been difficult and strained in the early days now felt more natural, more accessible. But new challenges also emerged. There were periods of doubt, times when the whole enterprise seemed pointless or delusional. There were periods of dullness, when the mind became foggy and unclear and practice felt mechanical. There were periods of restlessness, when sitting still felt unbearable and the mind generated endless reasons why they should be doing something else. The monk addressed each of these challenges with patient guidance. For doubt, he suggested examining its nature rather than trying to suppress it. What is doubt? Where does it come from? Is the doubting mind any more reliable than the believing mind? For dullness, he recommended more walking meditation, clearer attention to posture, and sometimes just accepting the dullness as part of the practice rather than fighting against it. For restlessness, he taught how to work with the energy rather than against it, channeling it into more focused attention or physical activity before returning to stillness. One breakthrough came during a particularly difficult period of practice. The young person had been sitting in meditation, struggling with intense restlessness and agitation, when suddenly they stopped fighting against it and simply allowed the restlessness to be present. They brought attention to the sensations of restlessness in the body, the jittery energy, the urge to move, the mental agitation. Without trying to change or suppress these sensations, simply observing them with interested attention, something remarkable happened. The restlessness, when met with this quality of allowing awareness, began to transform. It was still present, but it no longer felt like a problem to be solved. The relationship to the restlessness had changed, and in that change, there was a kind of peace, even in the midst of agitation. When the young person described this experience to the monk, he smiled broadly. "This is a crucial understanding," he said. "The freedom we seek is not found in having only pleasant experiences and never having unpleasant ones. It is found in a different relationship to all experience, a capacity to be present with whatever arises without being overwhelmed by it, without needing to fight against it or grasp after it. This is what we mean by equanimity, Not indifference, but a kind of balanced, open awareness that can hold all experience without being thrown off center. He elaborated, "Most people spend their lives in a constant battle with their own experience, trying to have more of what they like and less of what they don't like. This battle creates enormous suffering because you cannot control experience the way you wish you could. Circumstances change, pleasant experiences end, unpleasant experiences arise, despite your best efforts to avoid them. But when you develop the capacity to be present with experience without constant resistance and manipulation, when you can simply be with what is, then you discover a freedom that is not dependent on circumstances. You can be at peace even when circumstances are difficult." This teaching transformed the young person's practice. They began to approach difficult experiences, physical pain, emotional discomfort, mental confusion, not as enemies to be defeated, but as teachers, as opportunities to develop the capacity to remain present and aware regardless of what was arising. This did not mean they became passive or stopped taking action to improve difficult circumstances. It meant they stopped adding an extra layer of suffering through resistance and complaint. As winter reached its depth, the hermitage was often covered in snow, the world outside reduced to shades of white and grey. The silence of the mountain deepened, broken only by the occasional call of a crow or the sound of snow sliding off the roof. In this profound quiet, the young person's practice took on a new intensity, a deepening that was not forced but seemed to arise naturally from the conditions, the silence, the stillness, the rhythmic simplicity of life in this remote place. The monk spoke one morning about loving kindness, returning to a theme he had introduced earlier, but now developing it more fully. "We have talked about compassion," he said, "but I want to distinguish between compassion and loving kindness, though they are closely related. Compassion is the response to suffering, the arising of care and concern when you encounter pain in yourself or others. Loving kindness, or metta, is more fundamental. It is the basic attitude of goodwill and friendliness toward all beings, independent of whether they are currently suffering or not. It is the recognition that all beings want to be happy and want to avoid suffering, and the genuine wish that they succeed in this aspiration." He continued, "Loving kindness is not the same as emotional love or affection, which are usually selective and conditional. You feel love for people who please you, who meet your needs, who are kind to you. But loving kindness is unconditional. It extends to all beings regardless of whether you like them, regardless of whether they have treated you well or badly." This may sound impossible or even undesirable. Why should you wish well for people who harm you? But loving kindness is not about approving of harmful behavior. It is about recognizing the shared nature of all beings. We all want happiness. We all suffer. We're all struggling with the human condition. To hold animosity and ill will toward others, even those who have harmed you, creates suffering in yourself. Loving kindness is a gift you give yourself as much as a gift you give to others. The young person practiced the loving kindness meditation with renewed dedication, working consciously with the resistances that arose. It was relatively easy to wish well for people they liked, more challenging with neutral people, and quite difficult with people they found difficult or who had hurt them. But the monk encouraged them to persist gently, not forcing or pretending, but gradually softening the heart's boundaries, expanding the circle of care. "Notice what happens when you hold someone in mind with genuine goodwill," the monk said. "Even if you cannot generate warm feelings toward them, simply holding the intention, 'May this person be happy, may they be free from suffering,' begins to shift something. The bitterness and resentment that you may have been carrying starts to lose its charge. This is not about condoning harmful actions or making yourself vulnerable to abuse. It is about freeing yourself from the poison of hatred and animosity, which harms you more than it harms the person toward whom it is directed." One afternoon, a difficult situation arose that tested the young person's practice. a group of hunters came up the mountain, tracking a deer. They were loud and aggressive, disturbing the tranquil atmosphere of the hermitage. One of them saw the monk and the young person and made disparaging comments about people who wasted their lives in prayer and meditation instead of doing real work. The young person felt anger rising, felt defensive and indignant, but they noticed the anger, recognized it as it arose, and instead of acting from it immediately, they paused. In that pause, they remembered the teachings about loving kindness, about seeing the suffering in others that drives their unskillful behavior. They saw that the hunter was expressing his own insecurity, his own confusion about meaning and value. This recognition did not make the hunter's rudeness okay, but it changed the young person's internal response. Instead of anger, there was something closer to compassion, mixed with a kind of sadness that people could be so lost, so defended, so unable to see beyond their own narrow perspectives. The monk handled the situation with remarkable grace, neither defensive nor aggressive, simply acknowledging the hunter's presence and offering them water, which they accepted somewhat sheepishly before moving on. After they left, the monk said, "You were tested just now. I saw you catch yourself, saw you choose a response rather than simply reacting. This is the fruit of practice, not that you never feel anger or other difficult emotions, but that you have space around them, that you can choose wisely, rather than being driven by every emotional wind that blows." The young person felt proud of having passed this test, but the monk gently deflated this pride. Do not take too much satisfaction in one moment of skillful response. The test will come again, perhaps in a harder form, and you may not do as well. The practice is ongoing, never finished. There is no point at which you have mastered it completely and can relax. Each moment is fresh, each situation unique, each requiring conscious awareness and wise response. As the winter progressed towards spring, the young person began to think about their eventual return to the village. They had been at the hermitage for many months now, and while part of them wanted to stay indefinitely in this protected environment, another part recognized that the real test of practice would come when they returned to ordinary life, to the demands and complexities that they had left behind. They raised this with the monk, who nodded thoughtfully. The monk listened carefully as the young person expressed their concerns about returning to the village, their worry that the clarity and peace they had found on the mountain would be lost in the chaos of ordinary life. When they finished, the monk was quiet for a moment before speaking. "Your concern is understandable," he said, "and it points to an important truth. The peace you have found here is partly due to external conditions, the quiet, the simplicity, the absence of demanding relationships and complex situations. If you believe that this peace depends entirely on these external conditions, then yes, you will lose it when you return. But if you have truly understood the teachings, you will recognize that the peace is not created by external conditions, but by internal conditions, by the quality of awareness, by the letting go of resistance, by the recognition of your true nature. These internal conditions can be maintained regardless of external circumstances." He continued, "The mountain is a training ground, a place to develop the capacities of awareness and equanimity in a supportive environment. But the point is not to live permanently in protective retreat. The point is to develop these capacities so thoroughly that you can maintain them even in challenging conditions, so that you can bring the fruits of practice into the world, into relationship, into the complex and messy reality of human life." The young person understood intellectually, but still felt uncertain about their ability to maintain practice in the midst of ordinary life. The monk seemed to read this doubt. "Let me tell you a story," he said. "There was a practitioner who spent 20 years in solitary retreat, meditating for many hours each day, developing deep states of concentration and insight. He believed he had achieved a high level of realization. When he finally came out of retreat and returned to ordinary life, he was shocked to discover how quickly his equanimity vanished in the face of traffic jams, difficult people, and the demands of daily life. He realized that his practice had been somewhat artificial, developed only in ideal conditions. He returned to his teacher and said, "My years of practice seem to have been wasted. I am no better at handling life than I was before." His teacher replied, "Your practice was not wasted. You developed essential capacities during your retreat." But now comes the second part of training, learning to apply those capacities in the midst of life's complexity. This is harder than practicing in retreat, but it is also more valuable because it develops a stability that is truly unshakable, tested, and proven in the crucible of real-world challenges. The young person absorbed this story, recognizing that their time on the mountain was not an end in itself, but a preparation for a different kind of practice, the practice of awakening in the midst of life. The monk sensed that they were ready to begin thinking about their return. "Before you go," he said, "let me offer some guidance for maintaining practice when you return to the village. First, establish a daily meditation practice, even if brief. Better to sit for 15 minutes each day consistently than to sit for an hour occasionally. Second, create pauses throughout your day, moments to check in with yourself, to notice your state of mind, to reconnect with awareness. Third, bring conscious attention to transitions, the moment when you wake up, when you finish one activity and begin another, when you enter your home. These transition moments are opportunities to reset, to come back to presence. Fourth, choose relationships and activities that support your practice. You cannot control everything in your environment, but you can make choices about where you spend your time and with whom. Fifth, find or create a community of practice, people who share your values and aspirations, who can support and encourage you on the path. These instructions were practical and concrete, very different from the more abstract philosophical teachings that had characterized much of the young person's time on the mountain. They wrote them down carefully, committing them to memory. Over the next several weeks, they prepared for their departure, helping with extra work around the hermitage, gathering supplies for the journey down the mountain. There was a quality of completion settling into the experience, a sense that a chapter was ending. One evening, near the end of their stay, the monk shared some final teachings. "Everything we have discussed," he said, "can be summarized in a few essential points. First, recognize that your true nature is awareness itself, boundless and free, not the limited and defended ego you usually take yourself to be. Second, see that all suffering comes from resisting reality as it is, from the gap between how things are and how you insist they should be. Third, practice being present to each moment without constant judgment and evaluation. Fourth, cultivate the qualities of wisdom and compassion, seeing clearly and responding with kindness. Fifth, understand that the spiritual path is not about becoming someone else or achieving some special state, but about recognizing what is true and living in alignment with that truth." He paused, looking at the young person with great tenderness. "You came here desperate for relief from suffering, seeking some technique or teaching that would fix your life. What you have discovered is both simpler and more profound than any technique. You have discovered that the treasure you were seeking was within you all along, that the peace and freedom you longed for were not dependent on changing external circumstances, but on recognizing your true nature. This recognition does not happen once and for all. It must be renewed again and again, deepened through practice and through the challenges of daily life. The path is not a linear progression toward a fixed goal, but a spiral that returns again and again to the same fundamental truths at deeper levels of understanding and integration." The final days at the hermitage had a bittersweet quality. The young person felt grateful for everything they had learned and experienced, yet also uncertain about leaving the safety and simplicity of this mountain retreat. The monk continued to offer teachings, but they had a different flavor now, more focused on practical application, more concerned with how to live an awakened life in the midst of worldly activity. "One of the most important practices as you return to the village," the monk said, "is right livelihood. This means earning your living in a way that does not cause harm, that is aligned with your values and understanding. Many people divide their lives into compartments. There is the spiritual life, practiced in meditation or at the temple, and then there is ordinary life, where different rules apply. But this division creates a fundamental split that prevents genuine integration and wholeness. The goal is to bring consciousness and ethical clarity to all aspects of life, including how you make your living, how you spend your money, how you treat people in business and work contexts. The young person had not thought much about this dimension. They asked, "But what if my work is not particularly meaningful? What if I must do ordinary tasks to survive?" The monk nodded. The meaning is not inherent in the tasks themselves, but in the quality of attention and care you bring to them. Any honest work, done with awareness and dedication, can be a form of practice. The key is to avoid work that directly causes harm, that exploits others, that damages the environment, that promotes delusion or addiction. Beyond avoiding direct harm, you bring practice into your work by being fully present, by treating everyone you encounter with respect, by maintaining ethical standards even when no one is watching, by doing quality work, regardless of whether you will be recognized or rewarded for it. He continued, "There is also the question of how much you need materially. The culture of your village, like many places in the modern world, promotes endless consumption, the belief that happiness comes from acquiring more things, newer things, better things. But you have lived simply here and discovered that happiness does not require elaborate possessions or constant stimulation. As you return, be conscious of the pressures to consume, to accumulate, to keep up with others. Ask yourself what you actually need versus what you have been conditioned to want. Simplicity is not poverty or deprivation. It is the freedom that comes from not being enslaved to possessions, from not having your sense of worth and happiness dependent on material accumulation." These teachings about right livelihood and simplicity struck the young person as particularly important. They recognized how much they had been caught in the endless cycle of earning and spending, working to buy things they did not really need, always feeling slightly behind, always comparing their possessions and status to others. The monk's words pointed to a different possibility, a life of sufficiency, of having enough, of not being driven by constant craving for more. On what would be one of the last evenings together, the monk spoke about relationships. "Human beings are relational creatures," he said. "We do not exist in isolation, but in a web of connections, family, friends, community. These relationships are perhaps the greatest source of both joy and suffering in human life. As you return to your relationships, bring consciousness to them. Notice the patterns that arise, the ways you seek approval, the ways you defend yourself, the ways you try to control or manipulate others to get what you want. Notice the expectations you place on others and how suffering arises when these expectations are not met." He elaborated, "True intimacy requires vulnerability, the willingness to be seen as you actually are, rather than hiding behind masks and personas. It also requires the capacity to see others as they actually are, rather than through the filter of your projections and needs." Most relationships involve two people relating not to each other, but to their ideas of each other, their fantasies and projections. Real meeting, real intimacy happens when these projections drop away and there is genuine presence, genuine seeing and being seen. The young person felt some anxiety about this teaching. Their relationships in the village had often been difficult, marked by misunderstanding and disappointment. Would they be able to bring more consciousness to these relationships, or would they simply fall back into old patterns? The monk seemed to sense this anxiety. "Do not expect perfection," he said. "You will fall into old patterns. You will react unconsciously. You will hurt people and be hurt by them. This is part of being human. The practice is not about achieving perfect relationships, but about bringing awareness to the imperfect relationships you have, about catching yourself more quickly when you fall into patterns, about repairing harm when you cause it. about learning from each interaction. The commitment is to ongoing growth and awareness, not to some impossible standard of always getting it right. On the final morning, the young person packed their few belongings, preparing for the journey down the mountain. The monk presented them with a small gift, a smooth stone worn by water, cool and pleasant to hold. "Keep this with you," he said. "When you touch it, remember what you have learned here. Remember that like this stone, worn smooth by water over countless years, your rough edges can be gradually worn away through practice and patience. Remember that the stream that shaped this stone did not force or hurry. It simply flowed consistently, patiently, and gradually transformation occurred." The young person held the stone, feeling its smoothness, its weight, its coolness. In this simple object, they sensed something of what the monk was pointing toward, the power of gentle consistency, the transformation that comes not through force, but through patient application over time. They bowed deeply to the monk, words inadequate to express their gratitude for everything they had received during their stay on the mountain. The monk returned the bow, and then spoke his final words of guidance. "Remember that the path is not about transcending your humanity, but about fully inhabiting it, not about escaping from difficulty, but about meeting difficulty with awareness and compassion. Remember that everyone you meet is struggling with the human condition just as you are, that behind every face is a consciousness much like your own, seeking happiness and avoiding pain, confused and suffering, yet possessing the same Buddha nature that you have discovered in yourself. Remember that practice is not something you do separate from life, but the quality of attention and awareness you bring to each moment of life. Remember that you are never separate from your true nature, that the awareness you have touched here is always available, always present, never more than one conscious breath away." The young person listened to these final teachings, committing them to heart and memory. Then, with a final bow, they turned and began the long walk down the mountain path. The journey down was in some ways more difficult than the journey up had been. Going up, they had been driven by desperation and hope, by the energy of seeking. Going down, they carried a different kind of responsibility, the responsibility to maintain and deepen what they had learned, to integrate these teachings into actual life, rather than just holding them as beautiful ideas. As they descended, the forest began to change. The sparse vegetation of the high mountain giving way to denser growth. Birds became more numerous, their songs filling the air. The temperature warmed as they lost altitude. The concerns and preoccupations that had seemed so distant during their time on the mountain began to creep back into awareness. Relationships they would need to navigate, work they would need to engage with, the complex web of expectations and obligations that constituted life in the village. But something had fundamentally shifted. Where before these concerns had been overwhelming, creating constant anxiety and stress, now they appeared as what they were, simply circumstances to be worked with, challenges to be met with whatever wisdom and skill they possessed. There was less identification with the drama, less sense that their fundamental well-being depended on how these situations resolved. They could engage with life while not being entirely caught up in it, participating while maintaining some connection to the spacious awareness that they had learned to recognize. By late afternoon, they reached the edge of the village. From the hillside, they could see the familiar buildings, the market square, the temple, the houses where their family and friends lived. They paused for a moment, taking in this view, noticing the feelings that arose, a mixture of anticipation and trepidation, of homecoming and uncertainty. They touched the stone in their pocket, remembering the monk's words, reconnecting with the intention to practice, to live consciously, to bring awareness into this new phase of their journey. As they entered the village, people noticed them and called out greetings, surprised and pleased to see them returned. They responded to these greetings, noticing how easy it would be to slip back into old ways of relating, old patterns of interaction. They could feel the pull of familiar roles and identities trying to reassert themselves. But they also felt the capacity to meet these situations with more consciousness, to choose responses rather than simply reacting automatically. In the days that followed their return, the young person established the routines that would support their ongoing practice. They found a quiet corner of their home where they could sit for meditation each morning before the day's activities began. They created reminders throughout their living space, the stone from the monk placed where they would see it regularly, quotes from teachings written and posted where they would catch their eye. They began to seek out others in the village who had interest in spiritual practice, discovering to their surprise that there were several people who gathered regularly to meditate and study together. This community provided support and encouragement, a context in which to discuss challenges and insights, a reminder that they were not alone on this path. They also discovered that the challenges were real. There were days when meditation felt impossible, when the mind was too scattered or too dull to settle. There were situations where they reacted unconsciously, falling into old patterns of defensiveness or judgment. There were periods when the insights from the mountain seemed distant, intellectual rather than lived reality. But they remembered the monk's teaching that these difficulties were part of the path, not signs of failure. Each time they noticed they had fallen into unconsciousness, each time they caught themselves and returned to awareness, the capacity for consciousness was strengthened. One particularly challenging situation arose with a family member who had always been critical and demanding. In the past, the young person would have become defensive and angry, would have either lashed out or withdrawn into hurt silence. But this time, though they felt the familiar emotional reaction beginning to arise, they managed to pause, to take a conscious breath, to remember that the criticism was coming from the other person's suffering, not from any objective assessment of their worth. From this more spacious perspective, they were able to respond with some degree of compassion and firmness, neither accepting the criticism as truth nor attacking back, simply maintaining their boundary while remaining kind. The incident with the critical family member became a turning point, a moment when the young person recognized that the teachings were not just beautiful ideas, but practical tools for navigating the actual difficulties of life. They had always believed at some level that spiritual practice was separate from ordinary life, something you did in special moments of retreat or meditation, but not really applicable to the messy reality of relationships, work, and daily challenges. Now they were discovering that this separation was false, that the practice was precisely for these ordinary moments, these difficult interactions, these situations where unconsciousness usually reigned. Over the months that followed, the young person's practice deepened, not through dramatic experiences or profound insights, but through the steady accumulation of moments of awareness, through the patient work of bringing consciousness to daily life. They discovered that transformation was not a sudden event, but a gradual process, sometimes so slow that it was only visible when looking back over time. They could see changes in themselves that would not have been apparent day to day. More patience, more kindness, less reactivity, less suffering in the face of circumstances that previously would have created intense distress. They also discovered that the path was not linear, but spiral, returning again and again to the same issues and challenges, but at different levels of understanding. Questions that seemed answered would arise again in new forms, requiring deeper investigation. Patterns that seemed resolved would reappear under stress, requiring further work. This was not discouraging, but actually reassuring. The path was not about achieving perfection, but about ongoing development, ongoing deepening, ongoing refinement of understanding and capacity. About a year after returning from the mountain, the young person decided to make a return visit to the hermitage. They wanted to thank the monk again, to report on their progress, to receive further guidance. The journey up the mountain was completely different from the first time. Then they had climbed in desperation, seeking salvation from suffering. Now They climbed with gratitude and joy, seeking to deepen understanding that was already present. When they arrived at the hermitage, the monk greeted them warmly, clearly pleased to see them. They spent several days together, the young person sharing their experiences from the past year, describing both the successes and the challenges. The monk listened carefully, occasionally offering comments or questions that illuminated aspects the young person had not fully seen. "What you are describing," the monk said at one point, "is the integration of practice with life. This is the real work of the path, not achieving special states in meditation, but transforming how you live moment to moment. You are discovering that awakening is not an event that happens once, and then everything is different forever. It is an ongoing process of remembering and forgetting, of waking up and falling asleep, gradually spending more time awake and less time lost in unconscious patterns." He continued, "You should know that this process continues for a lifetime. Even teachers who have practiced for many decades still discover new depths, still encounter challenges, still have moments of reactivity or confusion. The difference is not that they never fall, but that they recognize the fall more quickly, recover more gracefully, learn more readily from each stumbling. This is all we can aspire to. Not perfection, but ongoing growth. Not the end of all difficulty, but increasing wisdom and compassion in how we meet difficulty." The young person asked a question that had been troubling them. "Sometimes I feel that I have lost something from my practice, that the clarity I experienced on the mountain has dimmed. Is this regression? Am I doing something wrong?" The monk shook his head. "This is a common misunderstanding. The clarity you experienced here was partly due to the special conditions, the silence, the simplicity, the intensive practice, the absence of complex demands. That kind of clarity is valuable because it shows you what is possible. It gives you a taste of awakened awareness, but it cannot be maintained constantly when you return to ordinary life with all its complexity and demands. What you develop through ongoing practice in the midst of life is a different kind of stability, not the clarity of retreat, but the resilience that can maintain some degree of awareness even in difficult conditions. This is actually more valuable, more mature, more tested. Do not compare your current experience to your experience here and find it lacking. Recognize that you are developing different capacities now, capacities that are essential for living an awakened life in the world." This teaching released something in the young person, a subtle judgment they had been holding about their practice, a sense that they should be more advanced, more consistently clear. The monk's words validated where they actually were, honoring the work they had done while encouraging continued effort. On the final evening of this visit, as they sat together watching the sunset over the valley, the monk spoke about the future. "You have established a foundation," he said. "You understand the basic teachings. You have developed some capacity for awareness and equanimity. You have tasted your true nature. But this is just the beginning. The path continues to unfold, revealing new depths, new challenges, new opportunities for growth. Some of what lies ahead will be difficult. You will face loss, pain, disappointment, all the unavoidable suffering that is part of human life. The practice does not protect you from these things. What it gives you is the capacity to meet them without being destroyed by them, to remain open and compassionate even in the face of difficulty." He paused, looking at the young person with deep kindness. The monk's gaze held something profound. Not just kindness, but a recognition of the young person's potential, of the journey they had undertaken and the journey that still lay ahead. "You asked me once," the monk said, "about enlightenment, about whether there would be a moment when everything suddenly made sense and suffering ended forever. I told you then that this was a fantasy, a misunderstanding of the path. Now that you have practiced for some time, you can understand this more deeply. The freedom that practice offers is not freedom from the human condition, but freedom within it. You will still experience pain, loss, difficulty, aging, sickness, and death. These are unavoidable aspects of having a human body and living in a world of constant change. What changes is your relationship to these experiences. You suffer less not because difficult things stop happening, but because you stop adding unnecessary suffering to the unavoidable pain of life. The young person nodded, understanding this now in a way they could not have when they first arrived at the hermitage. They had experienced enough to know the difference between pain and suffering, between the direct experience of difficulty and the mental elaboration that often made it much worse. There is a teaching I have not yet shared with you, the monk continued, about the 10,000 joys and the 10,000 sorrows. Life brings both joy and sorrow, gain and loss, praise and blame, pleasure and pain. These come and go like waves on the ocean, beyond your control. The awakened person is like the depths of the ocean, undisturbed by the waves on the surface. The waves continue. Life continues with all its changes. But there is a depth that remains stable, a peace that is not dependent on circumstances. Your practice is about discovering and stabilizing in that depth while still fully engaging with the surface, with the actual living of life. The teaching resonated with the young person's experience. They had noticed how it was possible to feel sad or disappointed about something while simultaneously maintaining a deeper sense of well-being, a recognition that this sadness was just one experience arising in awareness, not the totality of what they were. This capacity to hold multiple levels simultaneously, to be sad and okay at the same time, to be challenged and confident simultaneously, was perhaps one of the most valuable fruits of practice. As you continue, the monk said, your understanding will deepen through both study and experience. I encourage you to explore the vast treasury of Buddhist teachings more fully. Read the sutras, study the commentaries, learn about the different schools and approaches. But always remember that intellectual understanding, while valuable, is not the same as direct realization. The teachings are like a finger pointing at the moon, useful for directing your attention, but not to be confused with the moon itself. Your direct experience, investigated with honesty and awareness, is the ultimate teacher. The young person asked, will I need to return to formal retreat, to come back to the mountain, or go to a monastery? The monk considered this. It depends. Some people benefit greatly from periodic intensive practice, from retreats where they can deepen their meditation and study. Others find that their practice is best supported by daily consistency in the midst of ordinary life. You will need to discover what serves your development. Be attentive to what actually helps your practice deepen versus what the mind thinks should help. Sometimes people do retreats because they believe they should, not because it actually serves their practice. Sometimes people avoid retreats out of fear or laziness, not because they are genuinely better served by daily practice alone. Bring discernment to this question. As the young person prepared to leave the next morning, the monk walked with them to the edge of the hermitage grounds. Before they parted, the monk placed his hand on the young person's shoulder. I see in you a genuine aspiration, a sincere dedication to the path. This aspiration is precious. Protect it, nurture it, let it guide your choices, but also hold it lightly. Do not turn the spiritual path into another form of ambition or achievement seeking. The goal is not to become a great practitioner or an enlightened master. The goal is simply to wake up, to live with awareness and compassion, to recognize your true nature and live in alignment with it. This is equally available to the greatest scholar and the simplest peasant, to the dedicated monastic and the busy householder. It is not a matter of status or achievement, but of recognition and embodiment. The young person bowed deeply, holding the monk in their awareness with profound gratitude. They knew that while they might return to visit occasionally, they were now truly on their own, responsible for their own practice, their own continued development. This was simultaneously daunting and empowering. They were no longer a student dependent on a teacher, but a practitioner taking ownership of their own path. The descent from the mountain was contemplative. The young person reflected on everything they had learned, everything they had experienced, over the course of their time with the monk. The teachings had given them a framework, a way of understanding their experience. The practices had given them tools, methods for cultivating awareness and compassion. But beyond frameworks and techniques, they had been given something more fundamental, a glimpse of their true nature, a recognition that the peace and freedom they sought were not distant attainments, but always present, waiting to be recognized. As they re-entered the village, they felt different than they had after their first return. Then, they had been somewhat tentative, uncertain how to integrate what they had learned. Now they felt more grounded, more confident, not because they believed they had mastered anything, but because they trusted the process, trusted that continued practice would continue to bear fruit, trusted that the path was reliable even when progress was not obvious. Life in the village continued with its usual complexity, relationships to navigate, work to accomplish, challenges to meet. But the young person approached it all with a different quality, more present, more aware, more compassionate toward themselves and others. They made mistakes, of course, fell into old patterns, experienced frustration and disappointment. But these were held differently now, seen as part of the path rather than as failures or setbacks. Years passed, and the young person's practice matured and deepened through the ongoing commitment to awareness in daily life. What had once seemed difficult and requiring constant effort gradually became more natural, more integrated into who they were. The practices of meditation, mindfulness, compassion, and inquiry were no longer something they did separate from themselves, but had become woven into the fabric of their being. They found that they had developed a certain reputation in the village, though they had never sought it. People began to come to them with questions, seeking guidance for their own struggles. At first, this was uncomfortable. Who were they to teach others? They were just a practitioner themselves, still learning, still stumbling. But they remembered the monk's teaching about the bodhisattva path, about serving others as part of one's own practice. They shared what they had learned when asked, always making clear that they were not presenting themselves as a master, but simply as someone who had traveled a bit further on the path and could perhaps illuminate some of the territory. In their interactions with those who came seeking guidance, the young person discovered something profound. Teaching deepened their own understanding. Questions they were asked forced them to clarify their understanding. Struggles others brought to them highlighted patterns they had not fully resolved in themselves. The attempt to articulate the teachings to others revealed gaps in their comprehension. In this way, teaching became an extension of practice, another dimension of the path. They were particularly moved by how universal the suffering they encountered was. Different people, different circumstances, different specific challenges, but always the same fundamental patterns. The sense of inadequacy, the craving for what was absent, the resistance to what was present, the identification with thoughts and emotions, the belief in a solid, separate self that needed to be defended and promoted. Seeing this in others deepened their compassion, made visceral the teaching about the shared nature of human experience. There were also unexpected challenges as their practice deepened. One was the discovery that spiritual progress, rather than making life simpler, sometimes made it more complex. As awareness sharpened, they became more sensitive to suffering, both their own and others. The defense mechanisms that had protected them from feeling too much gradually dissolved, leaving them more vulnerable, more tender, more easily touched by the pain of the world. This required developing new capacities, the ability to be open without being overwhelmed, to feel deeply without losing balance, to remain compassionate without collapsing into empathetic distress. Another challenge was the subtle ways that spiritual practice could become co-opted by ego, turned into another form of self-improvement or achievement seeking. They noticed times when they felt superior to others who were not practicing, when they judged people as unaware or unconscious, when they took pride in their equanimity or their insights. Each time they caught these patterns, they had to return to the fundamental teachings about no self, about the emptiness of the apparent practitioner, about the fact that there was no separate self to take credit for any progress. The diamond that had been hidden was being recognized, but the recognition itself was not an accomplishment of an individual entity. It was simply seeing what had always been true. One of the deepest shifts that occurred over time was the transformation of their relationship with death. Where once death had been a distant abstraction or a feared enemy, it gradually became a friend, a teacher, a constant reminder to live fully. They had continued the death meditation practice the monk had introduced, regularly contemplating their own mortality. This practice, rather than being morbid or depressing, brought an intensity and appreciation to life, a recognition that each moment was precious precisely because it was finite. When people asked them what had changed most fundamentally through their practice, the young person would often pause before answering. So much had changed that it was hard to articulate. But if pressed, they would say something like this: "What has changed most is not any particular circumstance of my life, but the quality of awareness I bring to life. I still experience difficulty, disappointment, pain. But I suffer less because I resist what is arising less. I am more able to be present with what is, whether pleasant or unpleasant, without adding layers of judgment and story that multiply suffering. I know myself less as the small, defended, separate self, and more as the awareness in which all experience appears. This doesn't mean I have transcended ego or achieved enlightenment. I still have patterns and reactions, still get caught in identification and confusion. But there is usually some part of me that recognizes what is happening, that can see the pattern even while partly caught in it. And that recognition, however partial, creates space, creates choice, creates the possibility of responding wisely rather than just reacting mechanically." They would often add, "Perhaps most importantly, I understand now that the spiritual path is not about arriving somewhere else or becoming someone else. It is about recognizing what is already present, what has always been present, the fundamental peace and freedom of our true nature, temporarily obscured by layers of conditioning and confusion, but never actually destroyed or diminished. The practice is simply remembering, recognizing, returning again and again to what we are beneath and beyond all the changing content of experience." As they reflected on their journey, from the desperate seeker climbing the mountain in search of relief, to the diligent student absorbing teachings and developing practice, to the householder integrating spiritual understanding into daily life, to the person who now occasionally guided others, they were struck by the perfection of the path. Not perfection in the sense that everything had gone well, or that they had always practiced skillfully, but perfection in the sense that each step had been exactly what was needed, each challenge had taught exactly what needed to be learned, each failure had revealed exactly what needed to be seen. The diamond that the monk had spoken of in that first teaching was no longer hidden. It had not been found through acquiring something new, but through removing the obscurations that had prevented its recognition. Like the traveler in the allegory who discovered they had been carrying priceless treasure all along, they had discovered that what they sought, peace, freedom, wholeness, had never been absent. It had been here all along, hidden not in some distant location, but in the depths of their own awareness, waiting patiently to be recognized. And this recognition, once glimpsed, could be returned to again and again, deepened through practice, stabilized through dedication, until it became not just an occasional experience, but the ground from which they lived. The journey continued, would always continue, but now it was not a journey towards something distant, but a journey of ever-deepening intimacy with what was immediately present, always available, never more than one conscious breath away.